Signals by John Calder. This is one of only two short stories the author has in print. Originally published in the September 1966 issue of New World's SF magazine from editor Michael Moorcock, republished in the 1968 anthology from editor Judith Merrill called England Swings SF, and another in 1972 entitled The Space-Time Journal. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Signals. The signal was stronger this time. For some months, I had detected a blockage, an interference that appeared to come from some intelligent source, but it was being overcome by my friends on 647. I had been thinking of abandoning them altogether in view of the positive results of 291 and of 1143, particularly as we had now developed a relatively sophisticated language to communicate with the latter. But then our success had been so much greater with universes parallel to our own, and with one or two developed civilizations of the planet in which we are an atom, than with the worlds inside our own atoms, that my priorities were usually given to the last. Professor Herx, my lamented mentor, who had died the previous year after more than a century of research into radio mini-beams, never went in at all for the larger systems, and his principal preoccupation, after of course determining the mode of life of his receptionists as far as possible, was to try to determine the type of matter, moving or fixed, animal, mineral, or vegetable, that housed the atom in question. I find that such information, although interesting, is irrelevant to our researches, much too time-consuming and too hypothesis-based for its results to be credible. Professor Herx claimed that the type of matter at any one time had a considerable influence on the development of the worlds within, but this idea belonged really to the period when it was widely believed that inhabitants of planets in the atoms of our system and of those systems in which we are an atom might possibly be on a similar timescale to ourselves. We had found similar timescales, both up and down, so to speak, but they were a rarity and proved nothing. 647 was, however, one such planet, and up to about a year previously, far and away, the most successful exchanger of signals of worlds of their size in contact with my laboratory. The interference appeared to emanate from another part of the same atom, not necessarily from the same solar system, of which there appeared to be many. It came from an intelligent source and seemed to represent a hostility towards the signals emanating from 647, although it was possible that the senders of the blocking signal were trying themselves to make contact on the same signal, having detected the two-way exchange between ourselves and 647. The timescale of 647 was fairly advanced in our terms, as we appeared, in the 4 years that we had been in contact, to have been communicating with only 3 generations of the senders, whose lives were estimated to be 2 years long in our timescale. Now that we had found ways of compressing a 10-minute message into 1/10,000th of a second, there was no longer difficulty in transmitting in something very close to the receiver's timescale once it was determined, but we had found it more difficult to de-time the messages received, all very compressed and still full of ambiguities. Interatomic communication is still a very inexact science, in spite of the very great amount of money put at our disposal by the regional government. The principal laboratories on Mars and Venus were in some ways ahead of us, and in particular Professor Mearscliff's team, which was even more heavily subsidized, and was to be congratulated on having contacted atoms 2 stages above us by relaying through 111, with whom we have been in contact now for over 50 years. The Mars laboratory also benefited from the relative underpopulation of that planet and the smaller number of interfering local signals in the atmosphere. Nevertheless, when in the next 10 years we do succeed in physically breaking through into the magnetic field of 4, our brother atom in the molecular cluster to which we belong, the credit will lie principally with us. I shall have retired by then. Perhaps my dust will be enriching the soil of Erda, where I was first born, but being at the time of writing in good health for my age, I hope to live a little longer than that, a year or two past the breakthrough which I have helped plan. But I digress. 647, on the morning in question, had emitted a very strong signal. We had been receiving through the night from 980, a planet in a parallel atom of another molecule of our matter, whose time was much greater than ours, and who seemed unable to compress. In 6 hours we received a short, rather unimportant message, which was compressed and decoded by the computer into a short paragraph, and a reply was off again in minutes. I forget the subject. Some meaningless demand for protection. There are romantic dreamers and power-mongers, even in our own enlightened solar system, and other worlds that have developed to the point of communication with us cannot be all expected to have emerged from their dangerous periods of aggression, but one would have thought that interplanetary invasions would have been things of the past for such peoples. Certainly, there was nothing we could do. And then 647 began coming in on number 1 receiver. It gained strength after the first few seconds, and I, having just come into the laboratory and been asked to come directly to the interpretation room, began to monitor the signal. I was, I must admit, not in a good mood. My home life, as I've briefly mentioned elsewhere in these memoirs, had been undergoing a period of strain. An interatomic signals physiognomist enjoys much prestige today, and every new development in his field is seized on rapidly by the organizational news services, especially those that cater for the scientific educational establishments. The result is that it is almost impossible to have much peace and quiet unless one's family cooperates in keeping the press at bay. But when one's own daughter, living with a popular broadcaster and journalist, was constantly trying to get tidbits of news to feed her current lover and the rest of the press, aware of this, were trying to prevent Merlin from jumping in first by hounding me to distraction at home, it can become even more difficult to achieve privacy there than at work. And then my current woman. We had been together for over 2 years, and I sometimes jokingly referred to her as my wife, liked to have her musical friends staying until all hours of the night, when I was trying, the best pleasures are the old-fashioned ones, not only to do some reading from print. I am one of the few men in my profession still to get pleasure from a library, but also to get some natural sleep. Pills are all very well, but there is no sleep like that derived from lying down after allowing oneself to become tired and recovering energy by the natural processes of the body. Although dreams have been discredited as a means of investigating the psyche, I enjoy them, and I think my services to humanity justify my taking my pleasures according to my tastes, on top of which I shouldn't be surprised if the official attitude to dreams is not discredited one of these days. I've been told I waste time and therefore much of my life. Well, let them say what they like. I've had 3 honors for my researches, including the Medal of the Universal Academy, and although Spizzleton may very well have succeeded me at the laboratory, being stronger in intrigue than in science, I couldn't even see him earning a second-class Interplanetary Society award. And so the irritations of home life had been growing. I had only had pilled sleep for 6 nights running, as Joanna and her friends insisted on going through the whole night with Beethoven and Kurtzen quartets, all very pleasant to listen to, but I was unable to read except by putting on silencers in the next room. And I do not like silence. I get enough of it in my work. I would have liked to sleep, but sleeping with silencers is not the same thing at all. Therefore, my irritation. Also, the sex business. I know that sex is meant to be unimportant at my age. Many people keep it up with stimulants. Most don't bother anymore. The young are not keen on sex with the old, and the old usually do not overly attract the old. And in any case, an active sex life of 80 years or so is enough for most people. But in my case, and I take no aphrodisiacs, as I'm not especially keen on having desires and assuaging them and so on, nature still returns, and I think it is healthy not to suppress it. I had on occasion interrupted Joanna's chamber music to indulge in sex, but she says that it is very unfair to the players who had to wait for her return or continue with one part missing. She would say she preferred it in the afternoon, and her fashion editing allowed her to get off for an hour or so then. But it was my busiest time, and I was not going to give Spazulchin the satisfaction of saying that I seemed to be slowing down. Perhaps I should take things more easily and just come in during the morning. So, in brief, I had been neither quieting my still existing desires nor satisfying them, nor getting natural sleep, nor reading, nor doing much in the way of creative research outside the laboratory. And as far as I was concerned, they could relegate Beethoven back to the 19th century and Kurtzen back to wherever he came from. In particular, the Gross Fugue, which the violinist has never properly mastered, although it is an easy enough work to play today, grates increasingly on my ears and seems to be the most popular work in Joanna's repertory. But in a few minutes, my irritation had turned to excitement. It was definitely 6:47. The signal was not only getting stronger, but it had an added vibrancy that was being picked up by the colorer and turned into nearly comprehensive images. I went to the hypothesis computer that had already analyzed the signal into 77 different analytical structures and was now working out different theories of the meaning that was coming through. As I tore the analyses off, I felt the old power coming back. My fingers clicked quickly over the automatic thought recorder. Soon I had selected 10 of the more likely theories and fed them back into the reanalyzer for further digestion, while I concentrated on the giant transference screen. A pattern began to emerge, and I saw dimly at first, but more clearly with every passing second, the little bald, bow-legged creatures, their arms twice the length of their bodies, who were inside the drop of water that lay before me, a millimeter from the atomic needle that had isolated one atom within the water and was receiving a communication from beings on a planet within that atom. The creatures were in a state of similar excitement to mine and that of the staff around me in the interpenetration room. Their light was brightly colored and slightly misty, their planet lush with rich tropical vegetation. There appeared to be birds, large brown birds, circling overhead, but no, they came lower and appeared to be very like the creatures who were transmitting to us. They came lower, the others gesticulated, they dropped, and their wings folded into their backs. They were in fact the same species, flying men, near enough to our appearance to be thought of as men. The thought crossed my mind that one day there might be a sexual crossing with creatures such as these, but I smiled and dismissed the thought when I remembered the discrepancy in size. I calculated quickly how long it must have been since the last successful reception from 647. It had never been as clear as this. But they were trying to say something. I could feel the concentration as they tried to get a combined visual and thought image through the signal. The reanalysis came back. There were only two versions this time, and I concentrated again on the screen. Suddenly, there was an interruption, and quickly I thought, it must be the hostile signal, but it was different this time. Mocking, jocular, almost triumphant, and I could still see the creatures, smiling, concentrating, penetrating our world from theirs, enclosed in a universe that was part of a drop of clear, crystalline water. They wanted me to know something, to see something. It had been 6 months since the last comprehensive signal. Probably about 50 years had passed in their time scale, and during that time they had not only improved their signal, but had eliminated the opposition. It was obvious that the interruption had been intended to mock the other signal, that they had contrived to overcome it. They were holding something up. It appeared to be a head. It took 3 of them to lift it, and I looked at it with horror. It was like an enormous human head, lightly bearded, hirsute on top, with eyes that were blue and open. Although severed from its trunk, they had kept it alive so that I could see the eyes which looked at me with an expression of appeal, of fellow feeling, pleading a relationship. The little creatures looked uglier than ever now, and I could see the cruel smiles in their long, strangely shaped eyes. They had invaded the other planet. They had stopped the other signal. Had the other signal perhaps been trying to get through for help? What matter? Life so small, so brief. My own brain cells, my bloodstream, contained an uncountable number of similar atoms, all of them at some stage in evolution, some of which might perhaps contact our world one day. Thousands were probably contacting each other at this moment. Suddenly, the signal stopped. I looked away from the screen. Spizulchin, with the motion of his hand, had brushed the drop onto the floor. He hesitated a second as we all looked at him in astonishment, then left the room, the transparent door closing silently behind him. 647 would never broadcast to us again, and my growing indignation at the waste of all our work was only slightly tempered by satisfaction at realizing how right I had been to despise Spizulchin, who would never become head of the laboratory now.